Hey, don't mean to rush you, but before we get started, can you subscribe if you haven't? Got a big milestone I'm trying to hit, and I'm this close to reaching 30,000. Alright, let's cut to the chase. You definitely know what Pokémon is. One of Nintendo's jointly owned, biggest series, among the biggest multimedia franchises there is, etc. You've likely also caught wind of the controversy surrounding Pokémon lately. From the Delzethin incident, to gripes over graphics, to a lot of loud opinions about what direction the series should evolve in, you can't take two steps around gaming communities without a random encounter with an opinionated fan, even if you use a repel. The fanbase's infighting stands out when Nintendo's other main pillars aren't as openly split. But how'd it get this way? How did this upbeat RPG series for all ages about an alternate version of our world with superpowered monsters become so contentious? Well, as someone who's been around since Gen 1, I've watched it all happen, and I think I can provide the nuance this topic deserves. Yeah, I'm not here to spout knee-jerk reactions and hit you with a taunt or swagger or sucker punch. I want to do better than that. So, let's figure this out. What's gone wrong with modern Pokémon? We should address the elephant in the room first. The Cufant in the room? The last few Pokémon generations have seen a steady dip in visual quality, game performance, and other such things. The series has never been a graphical powerhouse, but the transition to 3 dimensions caused problems. X and Y were the first to stumble out of the gate, as their generation was the first to go full 3D. Sun and Moon handled their visuals better, but pushing the 3DS beyond its limits caused moments of lag, frame rate hiccups, and other performance issues. Sword and Shield marked a full jump to high definition, and it too suffered, with more constrained area layouts and shorter dungeons. Attempts to offset that with the wild area caused other problems, like the infamous Galarian low-res tree. And Scarlet and Violet, with their mostly seamless open world, have also been stuck with shoddy visuals, rampant hiccups in gameplay, and you've seen memes about the bugs and glitches. At this point, a growing and increasingly vocal part of the fandom has accused the developers at Game Freak of not putting in the effort to make the games look better, run better, or contain more content. But as someone who has dabbled in game design in the past, let me say this. Saying the devs must have been lazy is itself a lazy argument. When you're on the outside looking in, it's easy to assume the whole process must be simple if you just put work in, but it's infinitely tougher and more complex than you could imagine. And with how hard it is to make it onto these dev teams, you don't get many folks who just want to coast on a project for an easy paycheck. Frankly, it's annoying watching so many blindly assume these problems must be an act of sloth and not bother to look any deeper. Especially when signs are pointing toward the actual problem being something else, something a lot of smart people have already caught on to. These games aren't being half-assed, they're being rushed. So many of modern Pokemon's biggest nitpicks can be explained by the devs simply running out of time. Generally speaking, some of the final steps in a game's development are polishing the visuals, optimizing the code to run as smoothly as possible, and stamping out every bug that rears its ugly head. But when there's a deadline breathing down your neck, these steps tend to be cut down to get the game out on schedule. Even the one that did get delayed a couple months still has moments where it looks rough. Trust me, they didn't want the water to look like that from far away. They ran out of time to make it better. Being rushed also explains so much else about the recent mainline titles. Base games with less optional content, like not being able to enter non-essential buildings in half of Galar and all of Paldea, ran out of time to implement them. Weirdly short late-game sections, like Alola's 4th Island and Galar's final route, ran out of time to do something more grandiose. Shallower post-game trials and fewer minigames, they needed all hands on deck just to get the game finished. No time or resources available to make extra fluff. Even the infamous Dexit controversy makes more sense once you realize they simply didn't have enough time to fully update the models for literally hundreds of playable characters into high-res HD graphics. And the aspects that haven't suffered, like the music and the new Pokémon designs themselves, are less prone to being affected. Which means the core problem is probably the series' rigid 3-year generational cycle. Based on what we know, Game Freak's A-Team starts work on the next generation's flagship titles shortly after they finish the previous ones. But ever since the jump to full 3D, it's gotten increasingly harder to actually develop these games in less than 3 years. Breath of the Wild needed 5 to fully realize its sprawling open world. Expecting Pokémon to accomplish the same thing in roughly half that time isn't realistic. But because the Pokémon Company keeps committing to these 3-year cycles, each new generation's flagship titles don't have enough time to get that level of polish. And because an entire wave of media relies on the games kickstarting the generation, delaying them isn't an option. How do they fix this? Simple. Extend the cycle to a 4th year, allowing extra dev time for every mainline game. Gens 3 and 4 already lasted 4 years apiece, so there's precedent. Giving the games more time to cook would solve so much of what has ailed them lately. This is one of the biggest media franchises there is. TPC can come up with something to plug into that new 4th year, but will those in charge be willing to bite the bullet? But Pokémon games have been criticized for more than just bugs, performance issues, and sketchy aesthetics lately. Ever since fan goodwill started shifting, every mainline game has come under fire for something related to their design. X and Y had lopsided pacing, cluttered distribution of wild Pokémon, and a botched level curve brought on by failing to balance around the revamped EXP share. Sun and Moon got critiqued for long-winded cutscenes, frequent unskippable tutorials, and encounter rates so skewed toward older Pokémon that it's easier to find mons from Gen 1 than any new to Gen 7. Sword and Shield's wild area ended up underwhelming with too little to actually do. Its main story wasn't very well written, and, well, we talked about Delzethin already. And Scarlet and Violet have seen flack for their open world being hit and miss, with level ranges that aren't telegraphed very well and don't scale to the player's team. Difficult as that have been to do for a turn-based RPG. But there's not even a recommended level range for each area. All of this stuff? Yeah, valid critiques. You can enjoy a game and still point out what it did wrong. I'm doing this video in the first place because I want them to do better. But I've seen too many fans lambast the legitimate flaws of the newer games while putting the older ones on a pedestal, heralding them as beacons of elite design that these lazy newer games don't bother to try and match. The thing is, that's nostalgia talking. Pokémon games have always had flaws, and sometimes pretty big ones. Black and White, the games so often praised as ahead of their time, saw a lot of flack for the decision to only have new mons available until post-game. More than that, since most routes and dungeons only have a few available encounters, it makes repeat playthroughs less flexible for team building, especially with Univa's underwhelming starters gameplay-wise. And while Gen 5 explored complicated ideas the series hadn't before, a hot take, but the English localization has really awkward writing. Sometimes I swear I could have written better dialogue, and I'm not one to just say that. And the generations before it that us veteran trainers grew up with? Red and Blue are borderline unplayable by today's standards. Not just the janky code or the overpowered psychic type or equally OP special stat. It's also so inconsistent at signposting what it wants you to do next that it's easy to get lost with stuff like obtaining the Flash HM or getting into Saffron past the guards or obtaining the card key in the Sylph building without a guide or a bunch of classmates to ask for help. To say no less of Johto's terrible level curve and having several new mons unavailable until the post-game, Hoenn's repetitive ocean routes with nothing but water types and swimmer trainers to fight, making leveling anything weak to water in the late game a nightmare, and the many problems plaguing the original versions of Sinnoh. Pacing, level curve, excessive use of multiple HMs in mandatory dungeons, type distribution so bad there's only one fire type line in the wild, you name it. Truth is, this series has always been kinda scuffed. The premise, core gameplay, and social aspects were just enough to win people over despite that. Nostalgia can blind us to the flaws of the past. That goes for players and developers. Pokemon's remakes also have a bad habit of being as faithful as possible, even if it means doing little to nothing about the original version's most glaring flaws. If you're rebuilding an old game for a new audience, why not use the chance to create an improved version that captures the intent of the original better than ever, instead of preserving it near exactly for the sake of tradition, which is probably why each remake has also gotten progressively more and more criticism. And honestly, the reason why Heart Gold and Soul Silver have been mostly exempt might be because the devs had enough time to add a new Safari Zone, new Pokeathlon minigames, and a copy-pasted version of Platinum's Battle Frontier. Being critical of modern Pokemon's flaws is fine, but let's put it into perspective and not pile on the new games for problems that existed when we were kids too. Honestly, it feels like the games nowadays are being weighed down more than ever by out-of-control expectations. One reason Pokémon has endured for so long is its ability to appeal to people in different ways, including its spin-off titles. Even as early as 1999, the series was leveraging its popularity with side games that did different things from the mainline ones. Some were simple novelties with the characters pasted on, but others were full-sized experiences featuring new characters and new styles of gameplay. Some even took place in alternate worlds with completely different premises. While mainline Pokémon was known for playing it safe even back then, spin-off titles were there to be fresh and interesting. So, where'd those go anyway? Once the Nintendo Switch got going, those experimental spin-off titles kind of disappeared faster than a wild abra. Since 2018, the only full-sized console Pokémon spin-offs have been a remake of the first Mystery Dungeon, a sequel to Pokémon Snap, and a Detective Pikachu follow-up that didn't go over well. Has TPC really done so little in the last 5+ years to tap into this world people want to see more of? Actually, spin-off games have still happened, but they've mostly been relegated to mobile devices. On paper, that's fine. A byproduct of Nintendo dipping their feet into mobile apps when the Wii U was floundering, as an alternate source of income and a way to get a new audience interested in their mainline games. But while Nintendo deprioritized this once the Switch gained momentum, Pokémon has doubled down, and most of these mobile spin-offs have been simple things that pull in some money from in-app purchases and shut down after a couple years. The only ones that have managed to have legit staying power without any big lulls in content have been Go, Masters, and Unite, and even they've had controversies. More importantly though, while some of these mobile games have ports on the Switch, they haven't scratched that itch the old spin-offs did. Not fully, at least. Has the 3-year cycle left little time for anything bigger? Surely there's room for 1 or 2 more console-focused ones per generation, right? Especially since without them, it puts all the pressure of carrying fan interest squarely on the mainline titles, which, as we've seen, can go south quickly. Notice how many contributing factors there are to why so many fans have been so critical of everything Pokémon does nowadays? While the game's issues and the dearth of full-sized spin-offs lately haven't helped, this problem was going to show up in some form anyway. Because this series doesn't have one single fandom now. It has several, all into different aspects of the games, all wanting different things. Some grew up with the older generations, enjoying the more free-form, less guided feel of those titles. With the in-game plot de-emphasized, they loved being free to create a journey for themselves tailored to how they wanted to play. Other fans latched on to more linear, narrative-heavy generations like the 5th, wanting to see the Pokeverse's unique settings and world-building tapped for compelling stories that couldn't be told anywhere else, with the player actively invested in the outcome in ways RPGs are so inherently good at. Others still enjoy the quieter moments, the smaller slices of life that give more intimate glimpses into this familiar yet different world. They're the ones who especially appreciate spin-off titles and interacting with characters in the games. And I'm only scratching the surface. There are other groups of fans, subgroups within each, and more, including some who want to throw out the series formula completely and replace it with something trendier, though I don't think that's the answer. But you notice how some of these groups' desires aren't very compatible? Some want a guiding narrative, others want to make their own story. Some want an open world to play around in, others want something more directed. And each generation's flagship titles have appealed to some of those fans, but not others, which leaves the latter disappointed, bitter, overly critical, you name it. Is there a way to remedy that? Actually, there might be a way to solve nearly everything I've brought up. Rushed development, lack of full-size side projects, and unpleasable fanbase all at once. First, extend each generation from 3 years to 4, giving every mainline game within the generation more time to add the content they want and polish it to a fine sheen. Then, have each generation's flagship titles do what they're currently doing, just with more time to work. Keep them as big adventures about up-and-coming trainers catching and battling mons to become the best. These can focus on open design or a linear narrative, depending on which gels best with the new region and themes the devs want to play around with. That's year 1 covered. Year 2 can also stick to the current plan. DLC for the flagship titles that expands on the world while adding more content. Building off a now more polished base game, they could also add additional minigames and other side content to the main region. Year 3, however, would be where something new comes in. A new standalone experience, still technically mainline, that appeals to whichever parts of the fandom weren't the focus of the generation's flagship titles. If those were narrative focused, this new mid-gen game could be super open and free form. If the flagship games were themselves more open, this could be a more traditional RPG experience. Year 3 could also be where a big spin-off title comes in that uses characters and features of the new generation. Then Year 4 wraps up the generation with a Pokémon Legends game. These would still be expanded universe titles like they currently are, but free to get even more experimental than before. A place to try out new takes on the series formula and provide something fresh every time. And between the Year 3 project and, ideally, another big spin-off propping up the year, it'd be free of pressure to carry the generation. Is this plan realistic? I don't know. My game dev experience is on the amateur level. I'm on the outside looking in at the AAA game industry, and even I'm aware this plan would require more developers, resources, and financial investment than what TPC currently uses. But if they could pull it off, I think this might be a way to, in the long run, solve everything. Maybe. So that's what, I think, has gone wrong with modern Pokémon. The problems with visuals and performance, and content variety, are a sign the mainline games are rushed by a generational cycle too short for HD game development to keep up with. The modern game's design flaws are valid, but unfairly compared to idealized versions of the older games instead of the real thing. Spin-off titles, mostly migrating to mobile devices, with most being simpler fare, have put more pressure than ever on the mainline titles to carry fan interest, which has caused different factions of fans to fight more openly over who gets what they want from the mainline titles. Despite this rough patch, though, there might be signs of hope on the horizon. Not only are we getting another Legends game after the first was such a breath of fresh air, implying they will be happening every generation now, its vague release date of sometime next year might mean they're actually giving Gen 9 a fourth year and future games won't be as rushed. If TPC might already be addressing some of these issues, they may be aware of the rest. Maybe hoping for a more polished experience with less pressure on the devs won't be in vain after all? Hoping for Pokken 2 to finally happen? Well, jury's out on that. But are there other struggling games or series you think are worth talking about? Like the handful I've brought up already that you might or might not be interested in? Or the Smash Brothers content I'm known best for? Newcomer concepts, remakes for veteran fighters, and more. Real quick, special thanks to the people shown here for helping with this video. Shout out to my patrons for continuing to support me through all the ups and downs there've been. So, until next time, I hope to see you again.